The second. Welcome to the second in the Fortuna MBA Admissions Masterclass series, which today is devoted to letters of recommendation. My name is Matt Symonds. I'm one of the co-founders of Fortuna, and every week I get the chance to sit down with my remarkable colleagues to share their insider experience, incredible backgrounds working in the admissions offices of the world's top business schools. Now, this masterclass series, number one last week, was all about essays and what matters most to you and why, what business schools should know about you, those post-MBA career goals, how you're going to contribute to the community. It was a fantastic hour-long session. Lots of great questions from the audience. I hope that we see the same today. And so from having shared your voice today, the focus is on other voices, perhaps people that you have worked with, those close substantive relationships and how they can bring that depth of insight. I talk about the Fortuna Dream Team, and today I'm joined by my colleagues Emma Bond. Emma is a co-director at Fortuna. She was a former senior manager of MBA admissions at London Business School, and I hope that she won't mind me saying, because she's very, very modest, but she was ranked the #1 MBA admissions coach in the world this year. So lovely, of course, to have Emma's insights. And joining us from the West Coast, Pete Johnson. Pete is another of our co-directors here at Fortuna and is the former assistant dean of the full-time MBA program and oversaw admissions at Berkeley Haas, kind of the M8. I always think, Berkeley is even more selective than some of those M7 schools. So we've got a lot to cover in the next 45, 50 minutes. And I do encourage you, sometimes I struggle to, I'm listening so carefully to what my colleagues are sharing, but you're sending in these great questions. So forgive me if I don't get to all of the questions as we go through. I'll try to thread them into the discussions. But that fundamental question, the role that letters of recommendation play and how they could possibly swing the balance in your favor with the sort of insights and perspectives that recommenders are sharing, and who should you be approaching? Who are the right people? And perhaps equally, who would be the wrong people to approach? Giving all of you the time, certainly those recommenders, they might need a nudge after 3-4 weeks. You're certainly very conscious of your round 1 or round 2 admissions deadlines. So let's give them the time to really deliver something worthwhile and very special. And that implies the relationship that you have through this whole process, working together, what you will be sharing, and therefore the highlights and the details that they can be picking up on in those letters of recommendation. Sometimes we'll hear from clients, oh, but there's one more person I'd love to involve. Is that a good option? Well, of course, my fellow panelists have seen everything, and I can remember the stories. Pete thinks that I have an elephantine memory. I don't. It's just that he shares these incredible stories about 4-star generals from the Pentagon or on White House letterhead. These are the sort of things that they've been asked to review as part of admissions at the top schools. And of course, we always like to consider some of those pitfalls that you can then avoid, having stayed with us through the next 45 to 50 minutes. And then we'll wrap up. And as I say, I'll try to include all of your questions. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I really want to focus on what Emma and Pete have to share. Pete, I'm going to start with you. Big picture around the letters of recommendation and the role that they serve. Some people are, oh, come on, everyone's enthusiastic and supportive. Does it really make a difference? So can you perhaps provide some context on how a letter of recommendation can really make the difference?
Sure. Well, first of all, I can't overstate the importance of the letters of recommendation, because it's the one place in the application where the admissions committee gets to hear other voices talking about you and giving their assessment of your qualities as an employee, as a person, as a prospective business school student. And so that voice becomes very loud in this process for the admissions committee. And I think there are a number, and we'll get into this in our conversation today, there are some things to avoid, but it's an important part, because your recommender, if they do a good job on your recommendation, will be able to really share their view as a supervisor or as someone else in your company of your qualities as an individual, your value as an employee, your potential as a business school student. And the recommenders who do this well really make your application stand out. They can speak to you in a way that no one else can. And so selecting the right individuals to be those recommenders is a really crucial part of a successful application.
Right. I know that senior staff at the Harvard Business School and elsewhere, in their outreach to recommenders, perhaps the major consulting firms, some of the big banks, big tech, traditional feeders to the schools, and Eileen in Boston will reach out and say, we need your help. You know, we get lots of applications from great candidates. They've got strong GPAs, they've got, you know, high and competitive standardized test scores, and they're all on this fast track of professional development. So, you know, we really need, whether it's out of the London office or the San Francisco office, you know, we need these individuals to identify the superstars. Now, were you mindful of that, Pete, of certain companies and individuals, whether or not they've been to business school, but really going to bat for an individual and sharing that granular level of detail about the candidate?
Absolutely. And I think those are the letters that really stand out for the admissions committee. But I also want to caution at the same time, there are certain kinds of organizations that send lots of people to business school and in return hire many of them. And so it's unusual that you see a bad letter of recommendation from someone in a consulting firm. But if you're applying from any other background, please don't be concerned. We see lots of good, strong letters of recommendation from supervisors, managers, coworkers across a variety of industries. In fact, sometimes it's a little more difficult because all of the letters from McKinsey are good, for example. So teasing out the individual qualities that make one person stand out from another can sometimes be more difficult from some of those industries where virtually all of the recommenders have a very keen sense of the importance of this letter and how to write a compelling narrative.
Right. Maybe, Emma, I can take that point of Pete's, which is very well made. You know, we work with many clients from McKinsey, Bain, BCG, the big four, the big banks, and elsewhere. And sometimes we'll be able to pick up that here's an individual that has, over the years, written numerous letters of recommendation, and it's not clear that in 2024, it's really about this candidate. They've drawn on, you know, great materials. Is that something to be mindful of, almost like a fatigue? I've done this before, and this should work.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the case. It's probably one of the questions we get asked the most, or one of the questions I get asked the most is, you know, which recommender should I choose? And often when you're sitting in the admissions committee, you'll see the recommendations come in and you think, oh yeah, somebody's just whipped off another, this is the 25th one they've done this year. This is, you know, there's nothing much that discerns this person from the last person that you read. So it is really important that you spend time with your recommenders in terms of making sure that they know you well.
Is when, Pete, back to you, reading a recommendation, when it's a good recommendation, is it instantly clear that there has been that close, substantive relationship between candidate and recommender?
Yes. In my view, it becomes clear very quickly when you're reading that sort of a letter. And I think one of the challenges that people have, Emma mentioned one of them, sometimes a popular manager at a company will be asked to write lots of letters in a year. But you can tell from the way they discuss a candidate whether or not they have a close relationship and whether or not they've really had the opportunity to observe that person at work. It does stand out. And in the opposite way, it's really obvious when someone doesn't actually know the candidate personally or much about them. And I see Matt smiling. Over the years, we've had lots of conversations, and he does remember everything. But I did tell him a story once about a very lengthy recommendation letter from a very well-known person at the top of the US military chain. And it praised the candidate, Chris, in glowing terms and said, finally, you know, he's one of the best people that we've had in the Pentagon. Unfortunately, Chris was actually a woman. And so it makes one doubt how much they actually might have worked together.
So, yeah, well, those things can change. We'll be looking at that substance, something that seems vague and lacks that granular specific detail versus something that just jumps off the page, that sort of knowledge and insight they have about the candidate. But Emma, as we think about what makes a good choice or a bad choice of recommender, what should our viewers be thinking about?
So I think the first thing to consider is that you must choose somebody that knows you well in a professional context and who has seen you perform at work in the role that you're currently in, preferably, that can speak to the different attributes that you are looking to put forward to the admissions committee. What do you want the admissions committee to know about you? What do you want your recommenders to share? And if you can look at the person that you've chosen and think, yes, they can speak to my leadership traits. Yes, they can talk about my ability to take decisions under pressure. Yes, they've seen me work in a team environment and sort of those kind of mix of, I guess, of skills and characteristics, then usually that's the right person to choose. So often that's your direct line manager or supervisor, and there are some schools that stipulate that very clearly in their guidelines for recommenders that they would like you to choose that person. It's not always possible, and we probably talk about that in a minute or so. But I guess the second thing is that you want to be confident that that person, the person or the people that you choose are going to give you an outstanding endorsement, because I think, sort of as Pete alluded to before, sometimes I think people underestimate how much weight is given to these recommendations. And if you have not done the process thoroughly and not briefed your recommender thoroughly, then it can, you sit in the admissions office and read recommendations, and they will torpedo an application that otherwise is very strong. And that's quite depressing, because you think, you just know that either they didn't choose the right person, or they didn't spend the time, or they haven't sort of given it due diligence. The other thing that you can think about when you are choosing a recommender who's going to be powerful for you is whether that person has a connection to the school. So it might be an alum from the program that you're applying to. And that's useful on sort of for two counts. One is that they are likely to understand what the school is looking for, so the kind of characteristics that that particular school is seeking when they're looking at school fit. And the other thing I think is that if you have an alum recommending you, it's a sort of automatic tick in the box, because somebody that is connected to the school and the program is endorsing you as a representative of their brand value. They're saying, this is my brand and I'm okay, I'm putting this person forward and I'm recommending them. In terms of bad recommenders, don't be swayed by titles. The Pentagon example is perfect for that. So it's really tempting, and again, this is a question that comes up often when we're working with clients. Can I use my CFO or my CEO or my CIO or somebody starting with C, basically one of the C-suite people? And usually, unless you're in a small organization, that person is not best placed to comment on the characteristics and your work and your impact and your output. So don't be swayed by titles, I guess, is kind of the thing there. Sometimes it's tempting to use someone, especially if a school is asking for a direct manager. Sometimes that person is not always appropriate. If you have a promotion coming up and you feel like it might impact the decision making, and you are wanting to stay in your current role until the MBA starts, that person might not always be best placed. And schools will give you the option in the optional essay or something to explain why you're not using your direct supervisor. I had a client a couple of years ago who assured me, I kept saying, he was in an industry that was very unstable at the time, and I kept saying, are you sure that it's good to use this person? And he went ahead, and actually he and the only other person in his organization that was applying to business school were both laid off in the next round of cuts. And it's just something you have to be really, really aware of. And I guess the other thing is family businesses. So usually it's not a good idea to use a family member. Most schools stipulate that you aren't allowed to use them, full stop. In which case, what do? Many schools still require you to use 2 recommenders. So then you might go down the route of a client, somebody that you've worked on a project with or had an impactful deliverable for, or potentially a mentor, a professional mentor, so someone who's worked with you in a different capacity, but not in the current role, sometimes a previous supervisor from a past company. So the main thing really is to think very carefully about who is going to give you that outstanding endorsement that you need, and can they speak to what you are doing now, and I guess the different kind of impacts that you've had across people in your organization, processes, and I guess strategic contributions.
Now, starting the masterclass with who to ask has generated a blizzard of great questions, and I'll go through all of them because I think they're really, really pertinent. Before I do, Pete, I just wanted to pick up on, Emma saying, don't sacrifice, the quality, the intimacy, the detail of the letter for a job title. It doesn't have to come from the C-suite. But equally, presumably, if you only have a very tenuous relationship with the Kellogg MBA or the MIT Sloan MBA that works in the marketing team, trying to buy them coffee on a Tuesday morning and hoping to get a letter of recommendation. So again, we'd never sacrifice the depth and detail just because someone was an alumni of a school that you're applying to.
Correct. The most important thing is always to pick a person who knows you well, will take the time necessary to write a good recommendation, and has that level of contact with you that enables them to give the admissions committee a compelling and helpful narrative that talks about your strengths and your areas for development. Someone who's a little more distant, either because of title or because they're the only Kellogg MBA at your company that you know, might not be the best choice. Yeah.
Right. Now, Cynthia has asked Peter, and it was a comment that Emma had made about mentors. And companies, there are some that have a formal mentor when you join, not your direct supervisor, but someone regularly checking in with you. Others will have perhaps more informal mentors. It could be back from high school and they just followed your career. What are your thoughts on a mentor and how they can thoughtfully approach the sort of questions that the top business schools are asking?
I think a mentor is a great choice. I know that sometimes in mentorship programs, the mentor is not a direct supervisor. And if possible, I think a lot of schools like to see at least one of the letters from someone who has supervised you. But I think a mentor is a great choice because they're going to know you intimately in the way that will enable them to really write a detailed letter about you.
Right.
And hopefully, if they've been mentoring you, they also have the inspiration to want to share this information.
Right. Emma, you'd mentioned many of the schools require 2 letters of recommendation. Perhaps that gives some choices. If you've got sort of the cornerstone of your current supervisor, maybe some freedom of where you then look for another a distinct but complementary voice. London Business School, that you know so well, of course, requires 1. At Columbia, there are several examples of that now. So one of our viewers is saying, I could go back to a supervisor from 6, 12, 18 months ago where we had that really strong relationship, or my current supervisor of the last 6 months, but less intimate. Instinctively, if we're talking about that sort of time frame, going back a year versus in the last 6 to 12 months, what do you think might work best?
That's a really tricky one. I think you have to think very carefully about whether the person who's been supervising you for 6 months has seen enough of your impact within the current role, current organization to make it worthwhile. You don't want to go back too far. So I have had a conversation again recently with someone who wanted to go back sort of 3 or 4 years, and that's stretching it a bit. But I think somebody who was as recent as a year ago, 12 months ago, is probably fine. And they are likely, even though they're not currently supervising you, they're likely to have had more insight into you over a decent timescale, where you have been able to demonstrate those sort of characteristics that schools are looking for, the leadership, the maturity, etc.
Right.
And I think one thing we haven't mentioned quite so much is we talked about somebody who will endorse you, but also finding someone who is invested in your professional development can be a really important point as well. So somebody who understands the value of what you want to do and will support you in your sort of career planning and understands why you're doing the MBA as well.
Well, with that sort of support, Emma, does that give options to the entrepreneur, the self-employed individual? Perhaps they don't have a board, and they're thinking, well, who's the right person? I started this business and I don't, report to anybody. Where might entrepreneurs look for recommendations?
Yeah, for entrepreneurs, it's really difficult, isn't it? I think clients, if they have a client, if their business is sort of fairly established, otherwise, I think co-founders are an option, but then you have to be a little bit careful. There's a sort of vested interest side of things there, and with recommenders, ethics come into play much more than perhaps other aspects of the application. So clients, again, professional mentors, I think. Yeah, they are those kind of startup organizations and entrepreneurs. They do have a more difficult choice in identifying recommenders, but it's worth taking the time and thinking about it. I've had people saying, I'm only going to apply to schools that require one recommender, and that's not the best way to choose your business school, I don't think. So I think it's worth doing your due diligence and trying. There's usually someone in your fairly recent history who can speak to your character traits and sort of skill sets. So it's worth spending the time to think about that.
Well, we'll keep moving, but Pete, before we do, just one final question about who to ask. Seniority. Why are we typically talking about that direct line manager, the supervisor, the individual, that has that supervision of you? It's the mentor, not the mentee, the manager, not the person that you manage. Why is that important?
Well, it's important because it gives the admissions committee the opportunity to hear from someone who's viewing your work from a higher level role, as opposed to someone who's simply your peer in the organization. And that's typically an important aspect for someone to consider if they're really going to write the kind of letter that resonates with an admissions committee. It's someone who's viewed your work from that level. Now, that said, as we've discussed, there are many unusual situations where it's kind of difficult to get a letter. I mean, in some cases, you have a supervisor who would be great, but you work at one of those companies where telling them you're getting an MBA means you sort of are helped out the door before the annual bonuses come out. And so admissions committees, we all live in the real world and we know that people have situations. And if you have that kind of situation, it's also important wherever the application gives you the opportunity to let the admissions committee know why you chose this person. That especially if it's an application where you only have one letter of recommendation. Right.
Now here we are in the summer. Round one deadlines are about 3 months away, and then of course round two much beyond that. Approaching somebody on a Thursday and hoping that they can turn around that recommendation by Friday afternoon, Pete. That perhaps they could, but I'm not sure what would generate. So what is your advice in terms of starting that conversation, perhaps sitting down with them and making it a plan?
I would start that conversation if you're applying in round one. I would start that conversation right now. You really want to get a good letter. I mean, there are a lot of things that we advise candidates to do, but one of them is to make sure that you have those conversations with them, with your recommender, and you have a level of comfort in working with them long before they actually get the message from the application system to fill out a form. And there are a lot of things, even if it's somebody that you work with fairly closely, they may not remember all of the projects that you've worked on, including ones that you might feel demonstrated your best efforts. And so we want you to have time to sit down with them, have coffee, talk about your business school goals, perhaps talk about some of the things that you feel are your areas of strength or areas for development. Maybe mention a few of those really important projects that you were successful in carrying out, and then following up with a nice email and maybe in bullet points, kind of summarizing some of the things you talked about. All of these steps will help that person have the material they need to write a good letter. And so starting early is really important. And then the other aspect of starting early is that every round of every application cycle, all of us get a panicked last minute call. My recommender's spouse is very ill and they can't write the letter. What do? I have 3 days. you don't want to be in that situation. So I also recommend that you cultivate a couple of backups just in case. I don't know, Emma, if you've experienced this recently, but I'm always surprised at how regularly I get those panic calls.
Yeah, it's one of the first things that we work on, isn't it, with our clients, to make sure that we're ahead of the game. And you don't want them to be in a position where all the rest of the application is ready to go and their recommender's gone off on summer holiday and hasn't signed off on the recommender brief and submitted it for you. And yeah, absolutely, it happens again and again. So it's literally, along with sort of the overall parts of the application, along resume and things like that, we get the recommender briefs and things underway very quickly.
I mean, both of you are also alluding to this idea. It's not just great, they've agreed to write a recommendation, and hopefully in the time frame that we've discussed, and I'll just let them go off and you know, they'll say what they want to say. So Emma, you know, that first conversation that Pete was saying, and then the follow-up email, perhaps some bullet points, talk us through how to really successfully work with your recommenders.
Sure. I think the first thing to make to map out in your diary and theirs is time. These things don't sort of write themselves. They do take time. As we've said, the ideal time to start is now if you haven't already. But also you need to be respectful of their diaries, what they've got coming up. Everybody has sort of peaks and troughs in terms of demands on their time. So sitting down with your recommender when you're having that first conversation and saying when works for you, in terms of us maybe meeting to discuss the strengths that I want you to put forward about me, and when would be a crunch point for you where it's best to avoid. So kind of getting a timeline mapped up early, and then you need to be prepared for the initial conversation with them. It's not really fair to go up to a recommender and say, can you please write me a recommendation, and then expect them to write something that's brilliant and that has concrete examples of the last 2-3 years you've worked with them, because that's really requiring a bit much. So it's a good idea to sit down to talk them through why you want to do an MBA. So share your goals with them, maybe your short-term goals, your sort of ideal long-term goals, why you are looking to do an MBA, how you think it will help you have impact in the future. Prep them about your school choice. So which schools you're applying to. Not all schools are made equal, as we know. As sort of things that Stanford is looking for will be different to what Booth is looking for, will be different to what INSEAD is looking for. So sort of sharing what you can. Don't write them War and Peace, but giving them some notes on each of your schools, the size of the program, what it might have sort of a reputation for. That can be really helpful in making sure that when they come to write the recommendation, what they say is aligned with kind of, you know, what the school is hoping to get from that piece. Prep them about the process, let them know when the round one deadlines are, but I would recommend giving them what I would call an internal early deadline. So if you are sending them a briefing document, which we'll talk about in a second, make sure that you give them a deadline that is, I try and get all my recommendations with clients sorted out by the beginning of August. So really a month ahead of the actual deadlines. It's not always possible, but people go away in summer, they are busy, it gets pushed, and then you end up in a sort of problem situation. But also logistics of the process. Some schools need a letter, some schools need a form, lots of schools have some kind of leadership grid. So explaining how that works. Some recommenders will know, they'll have been through the process, but if they haven't, it's quite a detailed process. So giving them a heads up and taking some of the work out of it for them is always a good idea. We recommend a recommender brief. So when we work with clients, we sit down and help them sort of put a document together which gives recommenders an indicator of the kinds of strengths and perhaps feedback areas that they would like them to comment on. If you are wanting to go into strategy consulting, for argument's sake, when you graduate from your MBA, having a recommender call out your problem solving skills or relationship management sort of capabilities can be helpful. So trying to get what they are going to say. You can't necessarily tell them what to write, but it can be a sort of conversation along the lines of, I believe I have strengths in this area, would you agree? And then sort of helping them in that respect. But the briefing document, my opinion on this is always that if you do a brief, you take the hard work out of it for your recommenders, and the time that they would otherwise have spent trying to think of the concrete examples that we recommend they use in support of those strengths will instead be spent saying how wonderful you are and saying how great you are and isn't this person organized and etc. etc. So it allows them the time and the sort of flexibility to expand on your sort of capabilities a bit more. I think one other thing perhaps is to think about the ethical side of recommendations. So every recommender will be different in terms of how much input they want you to have in the process. So there are always, and I'm sure that there'll be some questions about this, what if my recommender has asked me to write the letter? That comes up so regularly. But other recommenders will be sort of less happy for you to see what they've written. So you'll give them the brief and then they'll just go away, they'll write the recommendation and then you follow up and check that they've submitted it. But that's kind of all done quite separately. Other recommenders say, I'm really busy, you know yourself best, can you write the recommendation for you? My guidance on that is to try and push back a little bit respectfully and politely and explain that if you are writing your own recommendation, it's quite hard to talk about yourself and say how great you are, but also you then run the risk of the tone of voice of the recommendation being similar to the essays and the other aspects of your application. So trying to just encourage them to at least put something down on paper. Maybe you will then sort of amend it and flesh it out, but something that's in their voice is a really, really useful thing to do.
Yeah, and I think we're going to come back to that one in the pitfalls to avoid segment of the masterclass, because I want to get some tactical input from Pete. Before I do, just a thought, I guess, in the last 15 years with Fortuna, we've put together tens of thousands of recommender briefs, and in almost every case, it's provided that helpful guidance, as Pete was saying earlier. Maybe have reminded them of a particular project and the input that you had. But if we think tactically, Pete, I could be using an essay to talk about that project and my role, my impact, my accomplishments. When you contrast that to all of that detail coming from the recommender, is it potentially more powerful when it comes from that supervisor that says, Francesca or Michael, whoever the candidate, just knocked it out of the park with this project, and they're the ones sharing that detail?
Yes, that is powerful. And the other thing that is something to think about as you're deciding as a candidate what messages you want to come through in your application, you probably want to avoid every piece of it talking about the same example. And that's dangerous sometimes too. If you decide, well, my greatest professional success was what I did on project X, so I'm going to spend my essay talking about project X, and I'm going to ask my recommender to talk about it, and then it comes across a little differently than you might have anticipated. I absolutely think that if you talk with a recommender and you think they're going to use that example, allowing them to speak to it can be much more powerful than you yourself.
Right. And if, for example,
absolutely.
I mean, you're working with clients, Pete, and you have an incredible depth of knowledge about their background, whether it's academically, professionally, involvement in the community. They've taken the GMAT 4 times and they still can't get that quant score into one of the higher percentiles. Is there an opportunity there for a recommender perhaps to pick up on core number skills and things that you're using in your day-to-day work that mean, this candidate's going to do just fine in the MBA classroom?
Absolutely, because the truth is there are a lot of people in the world that simply don't test well and end up with test scores that don't fully reflect their actual ability. And so a recommender saying, wow, she did a fantastic job working on this project that required analysis of a lot of data streams. And if you have a recommender who can talk about how you've actually done those things in the workplace, it is helpful. I mean, it won't necessarily overcome not having any background, but it certainly helps if you feel that the scores are not really indicative of your actual skill set in a particular area, particularly in quantitative or analytical fields.
Right. Now, this is one of 3 Fortuna MBA Admissions Masterclasses. Last week, Emma, and there's a great recording on YouTube, we talk just about the essays. Next week, we'll be talking about resumes and all of those smaller essays that are in the application form. There are lots of pieces of the puzzle. Maybe Harvard Business School spells out by saying, we looked at the resume, then we read the letters of recommendation. So now for the essay, what more should we know about you? Now, if I tie those two together, what does that mean about how you like to work with clients? If we know that recommenders might be talking about this particular project or this accomplishment, this impact, this value, then maybe we don't need to talk about it in the essay.
I think there are probably two schools of thought on that, actually, and you have to be careful how they're addressed. But I think, as Pete says, you don't want the same information to be relayed again, but just with slightly different wording in every aspect of your application. So ideally, you would perhaps use two different examples in your essays and your recommendation, but that are speaking to perhaps some of the same character traits and characteristics. The idea is that all the different aspects of your application will sit holistically to say, this is a great person who you really want on your MBA program. So using, and by the time people are applying to an MBA, they've usually got 3-4 upwards years of work experience. Hopefully there is more than one example that you have that can be used to demonstrate your leadership or your ability to work in a multicultural team, or your sort of technical prowess, or whichever skills you are looking to bring alive. But I think using the same examples too often is a bit of a red flag. So ideally, but there can be some overlap, but ideally you'd be looking to use some different ones.
Right. Pete, we've known cases where candidates have wanted to mobilize the classes of 2020 and 21 and 22 to all email the admissions office on their behalf and tell them what a great candidate you are. Or they simply say, oh, but there's this third person, that I'd want to ask. And so they're eager to submit an extra recommendation. Now, you set out the rules at your top school. You wanted 2. So talk us through, if there is ever an opportunity, or really if that's something to avoid.
I think this is something you want to handle very delicately. There are a number of schools that will say, sure, we're happy to have an additional letter from an alum who might be able to speak to your skills. If you have that opportunity, by all means, please do it. But if the school says, please don't send these, I guess the bottom line is the admissions committee is going to tell you what they want you to submit, and you should pay attention. Getting 30 additional emails from every alum that has ever worked at your company actually ends up having the effect exactly opposite to what you want. It doesn't land very well. So it's a very good point.
A question for either of you, because we've had recommenders that were presidents or prime ministers of G20 companies, that they are CEOs that we see regularly on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal. And the candidate has worked with them, but perhaps not in depth. But they say, surely, this very well-known figure. What sort of advice would either of you give when they want to bring in the Canadian Prime Minister or someone that we see in the headlines?
I think I'd have to back Pete on that and see what the admissions committee sort of guidelines are. You have to listen to what the school is saying. So we've seen the trend recently, perhaps for schools to go from some schools now down to 1 recommendation anyway. They are sort of streamlining the application process. That's gone through to essays as well. There are still some schools, like I think ESA still will allow you to submit up to 3 recommendations. So if you have an extra one there, by all means, use that person. But if a school is stipulating 1 recommendation, honestly, it's better to choose the person that knows you well, that can speak to your capabilities and sees you in a work environment. I think there are sometimes other opportunities during the admissions process when that particular document might be useful. If for some reason you end up on a wait list, there are times in that process where you can submit additional information in support of your case, and that might be a good time to submit that kind of a letter. But I'm with Pete on this one. You do not want to inundate the admissions committee with material that they have not asked for or have specifically advised against.
Right. So, Pete, if friends of my parents met the HBS Professor Michael Porter or Wharton's Dean Erica James at a cocktail party, it's not necessarily going to do it.
No, not very helpful. And even sometimes, as you pointed out, if you have worked for someone, I have read letters of recommendation from sitting presidents of the United States that are for someone who clearly, was working in the White House. But two things were kind of clear to the admissions committee. It was more of a curiosity, because it was clear that the knowledge of this person's actual work was not very strong. So it ends up being more of a, she's a great person kind of letter. And it also, I think for those of you who have had experience with leaders of governments and things, generally speaking, they're not writing these letters. One of their assistants is writing this letter for them.
Right.
And so, but again, I think you have to look at your own situation. And now I'll pull out the other story that Matt might have been thinking about that was also military related. We had a candidate when I was at Berkeley that we were kind of on the fence about for specific reasons, who had just a beautiful recommendation, really detailed, really positive, from a very high-ranking person who's well-known publicly. And I just couldn't, we were debating in the admissions committee, and admissions committees don't normally do this. So I want to point this out. We don't have time to reach out to 6,000 recommenders, but this one was so perplexing. I thought, I'm just going to call this person's office and I'll undoubtedly talk to their assistant. And I'll just say, I'm checking. I wanted to make sure so-and-so wrote a letter on behalf of this individual. And of course, admissions people also can be somewhat suspicious. So it came on letterhead, but I didn't call that number. I actually found the number of the office elsewhere to call. I got the assistant and I started out identifying myself and saying, I wanted to make sure so-and-so wrote a letter. And she said, yes, he absolutely did. I had to type it up, but he's in the office. Would you like to speak to him? And I'm like, what? And then I was on the phone with this very well-known person who spent 10 minutes, just gushing about this person, who ultimately, as you would guess, did get an offer of admission. But that's rare that would happen. And it's rare that admissions committees would have time to do that. But if you have truly worked with somebody who is, if you've really worked with, I don't know, with Barack Obama, and he knows you wants to write a letter, that's okay. Just make sure that it's not going to be a very distant, she's a great person and we loved having her at the White House.
Right. But at the same time, it does speak to your detective work, the curiosity and the enthusiasm that you have for the candidate, and the extent in this case that you were prepared to go to. The story finishes particularly well. I always love when you share that story, Pete. But sometimes recommendations don't work out so well. So maybe we can just back up and share with our viewers some of the pitfalls to avoid. Pete, where would you start with some of those things, mistakes to avoid making?
I would start with don't write your own letter of recommendation. And not necessarily because as a candidate you're dishonest, but there are a lot of busy people in the world who will say, oh, Emma, I'd love to write a letter for you, but I'm really busy. Why don't you write it for me and I'll sign it? As Emma mentioned earlier, I would push back a little bit, but if the person really wants you to write it, I would, thank them for their support and get another person. Because it's even hard for me after having years of reading these letters, it's hard for me to identify exactly which qualities are a giveaway, but you can really tell when someone's written their own letter. And that is the number one thing that I wouldn't do. The other things I think we've mentioned, be careful about getting someone only based on their title. If they either don't have the intimate knowledge of you to write about, or they're not going to have time to do it, or their assistant's assistant is going to write it. I would avoid those things. I would very much avoid waiting to the last minute, as we've discussed. And in particular, I want to call that out for candidates who may be applying from outside the US. The concept of the business school recommendation letter is, I think, fairly well known in the US and in multinational companies, but that may not be the case in the culture in which you work. And so part of that time, you will need to help the recommender understand that this really is an important part of the process. And it won't help me if you just say, oh, so-and-so has been great in our company and I've known his parents for 30 years. That won't help your application. And so I would avoid that kind of situation. Make sure that you have time to help your recommender understand, to do a recommender brief, as Emma was mentioning. We do thousands of them, and to keep them on track. So, 2 weeks before the Harvard deadline, you don't find out that your recommender hasn't submitted and they're on a trek in Nepal until September.
Right. Now, over half of candidates applying to top US schools are international candidates. But Emma, at schools like London Business School, INSEAD, that could be 60, 70, 80 nationalities in the classroom. That implies, of course, that there might be 60, 70, 80 nationalities of recommenders being brought into this. I'm not sure it's a pitfall, but in terms of the admissions office gets a lot of recommendation, as Pete was describing, from a great recommender in Washington or Cleveland or Los Angeles that really speaks to them. The Norwegian recommender, culturally, perhaps doesn't gush. They might comment that the candidate's performance was quite satisfactory, which in Scandinavian terms is off the charts, right? So was the admissions office aware of some of those cultural differences and brought that to bear?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you work in admissions long enough, you gain an understanding of different let's say cultural levels of enthusiasm, I think is the best way that I can put it. There are definitely sort of cultural differences across different countries, and committees that see these letters come in day out become very aware of where something will be a bit more gushing and where it's likely to be a little more terse even. There's different sentence structures, there's less flowery language, definitely less kind of enthusiastic adjectives displayed in things from the Nordic countries. We are generalizing here massively, but it is a thing. And there are also countries, as Pete's mentioned, where these kind of MBA recommendations are the norm. Through the US, when you've got all the M7 schools and a ton of MBA programs, most big companies, medium-sized companies, are used to writing a recommendation letter for an MBA program. It's not the case in a school that will be taking applications from many different countries around the world. Some of those countries, it's just some people will never have heard of an MBA program. They will never have heard of a particular program that you're applying to. So it comes back to that idea of you doing your due diligence in terms of appraising your recommender of what is going to be required of them, following up, giving them an idea, giving them an example letter if you can find one. There are some floating around online. And then checking in, staying in touch, making sure that they're comfortable with the process and they're not kind of floundering, which they're quite a big ask, some of these forms and letters and things. So yeah, but yeah, definitely cultural people are aware of cultural difference.
And of course there are English language expectations, which mean that you as a candidate will thrive and flourish in the MBA classroom, but your recommender, who might be a top executive, doesn't have a strong command of English, would you encourage, but they're enthusiastic to write the letter, if they wrote it in French or Spanish or Mandarin, and then it was translated, what sort of advice would you give in that situation?
I think that's a conversation that you probably have to have with your recommender. Hopefully your own English is good enough that you would recognize if your recommender's English is less expert, in which case maybe that's something that you need to approach with them and say, if you want to write it in another language, I'm happy to get it translated for you. Again, some admissions committees have people on their teams who are quite happy to read and translate documents, but most are required to be in English. So I think sort of going for, in the same way that transcripts and things sometimes need to be translated, it's probably a good idea to think about that ahead of time as well.
Right. Okay. Well, again, I mentioned how many great questions we've been getting coming in. So I just wanted to move to a couple. Sabarish could go back 3 or 4 years, Pete, for a letter of recommendation, or more recently in a family business. What are the guidelines around family businesses? Mom, dad, your aunt that writes the letter of recommendation?
Yeah, family businesses are a particularly challenging background in cases because you don't want someone who's related to you to be writing your letter of recommendation. You really want it to, it adds an air of potential inauthenticity that I think you don't want. Sometimes you can find a board member, sometimes if you're in a family company, sometimes you might be able to find a key supplier or client that you work with closely who might be able to write a letter. That is a difficult challenge. And I know that over the years, I saw many candidates who were coming from a family business background.
Right. Emma, another, seems such a simple question. Has the right supervisor in mind, but they've left the company, doesn't have a company email. So this could be coming in a Gmail or a Yahoo account. What are the specifics for that?
That's another tricky one, because some schools do actually advise that you can't use a Gmail account to submit your application. I think in that instance, sometimes you can write to just check in with the admissions team at the school that you're applying to and explain the situation. They might, if they're made aware of the situation, they might be okay to look out for it coming in from that situation. Otherwise, seeing whether, if you're ahead of time, whether that person can activate some other kind of account. But usually I would advise checking in with the somebody on the admissions team and just seeing what their feedback is.
For a reapplicant, perhaps it's a year, possibly 2 or 3 years that have gone by, but nevertheless, thinking about recommenders, I'm sure it's a case-by-case basis. Do they now look for 2 new voices or keep one of the voices from when they applied last year? What do you typically recommend in those situations?
Well, if it has been more than a year, I would definitely, well, in any case, I would recommend trying to have, if you have the opportunity for 2 letters, for at least one of them to be a new person who has very recent experience with you. One of the things that an admissions committee is going to be looking for in an unsuccessful candidate from a prior cycle is how have they grown and changed since their first application? And if everything that you submit is the same as it was in your previous attempt, you're likely to get a similar outcome. So I would definitely try to have a fresh voice if that's possible.
Great. Okay. So we've covered lots of the questions. You've talked about initially sitting down with recommenders, and we said with round 1 deadlines 3 months away, that needs to be happening very, very soon. And as part of this bigger picture and all of the pieces of the puzzle, where those voices of recommenders fit in with it. So any final advice, including even keeping them up to date as you go through this whole process, and certainly remembering to say thank you, given the efforts that they've made. But any final pieces of advice that both of you would have?
Well, I would say that as you are doing this, as Matt mentioned, be sure to keep your recommender apprised and to thank them when they have submitted. I also think making sure that your recommender knows that it doesn't only have to be about your tremendous strengths. Admissions committees are often looking for the awareness that the candidate or the supervisor has about their areas for development as well. And sometimes when you see a letter of recommendation, there's, you know, they're the best at everything they do and they have no areas for development. It doesn't ring true to most of us because that's not life. Everyone has areas of development. So in your conversations, make sure that your recommender understands that it really is a holistic view of you that the admissions committee is looking for.
Is that equally true, Emma, for the schools that use those grids and sort of whether it's a scaled score, you know, 1 to 5 on leadership and teamwork, integrity, and all these different things? And say, oh, well, I'll just, you know, put a 5 on everything. Life isn't necessarily like that, as Pete says.
Absolutely. And I think schools recognize that even the best candidate is not going to be outstanding in every single area. So it's better to be sort of authentic in your gradings. Usually people will fall within the sort of top 2 criteria. If you're asked a recommender, hopefully it's somebody that believes in you and believes that you do demonstrate sort of a strong showing across those kind of traits. But as Pete said, people do have areas for development, and if you were perfect, you wouldn't need to go to business school in the first place. So I think it's absolutely fine to be sort of in the kind of, certainly the top half, but usually around the top 2 in those kind of scales.
Yeah. Well, people that believe in you and it's authentic, it's a wonderful takeaway. We talked about this masterclass being one in a series of 3. Last week was about the essays. Of course, now these voices of individuals and the insights and perspectives they can share about you. And next week, we'll be focusing on your resume, bullet points, making sure there's not too much technical jargon. Perhaps how have you quantified or shown that development and growth that Pete was describing just a few moments ago. But the application forms themselves, which again, provide a tremendous amount of detail about you, your experience, your curiosity, your accomplishments, and all of those small text boxes. They're like mini essays. So we'll be taking a dive into that. And we hope that you can enjoy it. Of course, it's just one of the countless resources of Fortuna Admissions that brings together all of this insider expertise from the dream team. So, you know, I'm fortunate to work with Pete, with Emma, and with colleagues that have really looked inside, pulled back that curtain. They understand the conversations. Maybe they made that phone call to the White House to find out who was the recommender behind this. You've heard it here live. And we believe in you in a very authentic way. We take the time when you reach out to us to say, I'm thinking about business school, would love to discuss my next steps. That is a phone call and a discussion that we take incredibly seriously. Almost every call tends to run over time because we're having such in-depth discussions, and it's about you. We could talk about what Fortuna has to offer and the sort of guidance that Emma, Pete, and other colleagues can share, but it really is about you and your next steps. So, you know, we would strongly encourage you to reach out to Fortuna, and with all of those resources, whether it's webinars like these that will be on YouTube, there are many, many others. Some are school specific or theme specific, as we've done today. But we hope that this will be just one of those great building blocks as you pursue your own hopes and dreams and the road to business school. So I'll just end by thanking Emma and Pete every time I get to sit down with these 2 wonderful, wonderful human beings, remarkable colleagues. It is just an incredible pleasure. Emma, Pete, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.